Hi guys, it's Mrs. Schacht here, and I am here to discuss the farmers. So, why people moved out west, some of the challenges they faced, and how farmers become politicized in the late 1800s. So, just to kind of give you guys a couple of examples, as you can see from these photos, farming was not for the faint of heart. It was an incredibly difficult feat, and many Americans in the 1860s and 1870s moved out west to try their hand at farming. And one of the things that allowed them to do that was the passage of the Homestead Act in 1862. So, interestingly enough, this was passed during the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln, or I should say under Abraham Lincoln's presidency, and it was able to be passed because many southern states had seceded from the Union. A Homestead Act was something that many southern states had been opposed to in the past because by, giving Americans land to farm, which I'll discuss in a minute, they believed that if more Americans were populating out west and these were kind of traditional farmers and not slave owners, these territories would become states, and these states would probably be free states as opposed to slave states. So, what did the Homestead Act do? It gave each American family 160 acres of free, minus a small processing fee, public land, as long as they stayed on that land for 5 consecutive years and improved upon the land, then the land would be theirs free and clear. Now, if you look at some of these states out west, or kind of more in the Midwest, you can see the percentage of each state that was basically populated through the Homestead Act. And this amounted to about 10% of all of the land in the United States. However, as I mentioned earlier, farming is incredibly difficult. And a couple of challenges that farmers faced was a lot of the land under the Homestead Act unfortunately contained very poor soil. A lot of the land under the Homestead Act was also experiencing periods of drought, which obviously is not great for growing crops. And in addition to moving out west and dealing with the land, these farming families also had to pay for equipment, they had to pay for food, clothing, etc. And so we know that this is also the age of monopolies. So there are monopolies over the railroad industry, barbed wire, fertilizer, you name it. Anything that really has to do with farming has been kind of monopolized. So farmers have no choice but to pay the prices given. And so unfortunately, the Homestead Act, while it was kind of great in theory, led to a lot of difficulties and heartache for farmers. Now, another item that farmers, or at least small family farms, could not compete with was the creation of what's called the combine harvester in 1881. And I'm going to move my screen here so you can see what this looks like. The combine harvester pretty much did everything. It combined all of the elements of farming, from planting the seeds to fertilizing to harvesting and chopping down the different crops. This made farming more efficient. However, a lot of small family farmers, could not afford to pay for this, and it drove small farms out of business and created more kind of large-scale commercialized farms, meaning farms that maybe were run by, a company or several families. But some of the small family farmers ended up becoming tenant farmers, which is kind of similar to sharecropping in that they would rent the land and farm the land for maybe a larger company or a larger family. But it was equipment like this, as well as the monopolization of the farming industry, that drove a lot of those small family farmers out of business. If these small family farmers had stuck around, over the next few years, you'll notice here that there was also a massively big decrease in the price of wheat. So many American farmers were also competing on the world stage with other countries to sell wheat, both within the US and globally. And when you have more supply in the economy, right, it usually decreases the price. And a lot of these farmers, while they maybe are selling bushels of wheat, It's not enough to perhaps pay off the mortgage on the land or, any equipment that was necessary. So this also really drove some farmers out of business as well. Now, instead, some farmers decided that perhaps one of the things that they could do to kind of mitigate some of these challenges was to support one another. And so this is where you saw the rise of what became known as the National Grange Movement. And I look at this as kind of a big brotherhood of farmers. It was really a community. It was a network of farmers that tried to help each other out. Sure, it provided some social opportunities, as farming can be quite isolating, but it also helped farmers find the best railroads to ship their crops in. Tried to find other farmers to sell equipment to kind of cut out larger corporations. But this was really meant to try and A, support one another, and B, help farmers from being monopolized by the equipment and the price of seeds and fertilizer and barbed wire and everything that came with farming. And this is really the first time that farmers kind of become political. And one of the things that they are successful in doing is they are successful in encouraging Congress to pass what's called the Interstate Commerce Act of 1886. So as you can see from this photo, this has to do with the railroads. And what happened to a lot of farmers was if you produced perhaps wheat and you wanted to sell it, you had to ship it on a railroad, maybe to the next town over or even next state over. But railroad companies were charging farmers these exorbitant costs to ship their crops. And it caused a lot of farmers to be unable to afford it. So this is passed by Congress, as I mentioned, and it basically says that the federal government kind of has oversight over railroad shipping and costs, and said that railroads had to offer very fair rates to farmers. And it's really the first glimpse, an example of the federal government kind of intervening, if you will, into some economic issues. And that's something that's going to continue well into the 1900s, but it does benefit farmers. And as I mentioned, farmers worked incredibly hard. And if you look, I love this sketch because really farmers are the center of it all. You've got politicians, you've got, monopolists, you've got preachers, you've got bankers, but farmers feed everybody. Everybody depends on farmers. And so a group of people that really felt that was the Populist Party, also known as the People's Party. So as I mentioned, the Grange movement really started to take off, and there were like Grange chapters, if you will, all over the West. And they realized that, there needed to be a voice for the farmers in national politics. And so this kind of gave rise to what became known as the Populist or the People's Party. Now, obviously, at first, this is a third political party. And we know third parties typically don't tend to fare well or gain a lot of ground. But for a third party, the Populist Party did pretty well for themselves. They developed a platform, also known as the Omaha Platform, and it included both economic and political reforms. Probably the biggest economic reform was something called bimetallism. And if you guys have taken economics, you may know that, at this point in American history, all of the money in circulation was supposed to be backed by gold. And so the bimetallism movement called for the unlimited coinage of also silver, thinking that if there was more money in circulation, that would hopefully raise prices, including prices of wheat. And if those prices were raised, it would allow farmers to be able to pay off their land and purchase equipment and everything needed to be successful. It also created a graduated income tax, meaning it called for it, meaning the more money you make, obviously the more taxes you pay. And in terms of political reforms, some of the most important was popular election or direct election of U.S. senators. They also called for single terms for presidents and vice presidents, a secret ballot to end voting fraud. And a lot of these are going to be implemented in the early 1900s. And they also looked out for industrial workers out east. They called for an 8-hour workday as well as restrictions on immigration because it was believed that immigrants would essentially be job competition. The face of the party is eventually going to be William Jennings Bryan. This is not the last time you're going to hear his name in a push, but the Populist Party ran in the election of 1892 as a third party, and as a third party, gained a decent amount of votes, but obviously did not elect a candidate to the presidency. And so it's important to note, too, that not everybody agreed with the Populist Party. If you look here, this is a fairly popular cartoon, but it's kind of a patchwork, if you will, of different groups like socialists, communists, farmers, Knights of Labor, Grangers, Prohibition, and saying that, they were running on a platform of lunacy. So it was typically the Republicans who were anti-populist party, and it was believed that a lot of their ideas were economically terrible for the economy, that putting more, silver in circulation is probably what caused the financial and economic panic of 1893. And so when it came time for the presidential election of 1896, William Jennings Bryan ran as a Democrat, and the Democratic National Convention gave him an opportunity to speak. He was a great speaker, and he was very young at the time, too, but he gave a speech that became known as the Cross of Gold speech. And if you kind of look, right, he's almost like taking on this cross of gold, meaning I'm taking on this, this hindrance on farmers, and I'm going to continue to call for the unlimited coinage of silver. We shouldn't be just, worshiping, if you will, gold in this country. And this is kind of the cross I bear. This is the fight that I'm going to fight for farmers. And it kind of goes down as one of the greatest speeches in American history. So William Jennings Bryan, again, is the Democratic candidate, even though he's running on a Populist Party platform. And he runs against Republican William McKinley. William McKinley was backed by big business. His campaign manager, Mark Hanna, had tons of money. And William McKinley essentially just got to stay home while Mark Hanna ran a campaign through the media, through newspapers. Whereas William Jennings Bryan tried to circulate the country, gave thousands of speeches, and unfortunately for him, lost the election. The election is important because the Populist Party does sort of die out, and the Republican Party will dominate politics. And I want to say they will win 7 of the next 9 presidential elections. The Republican Party, you'll start to see a shift, and that they start to kind of embody the party of business and industry, which is kind of similar to who they are today. And so ultimately, folks, that's kind of the long and short of it in terms of farmers, their struggles, and their attempt to try and get some of their issues solved through politics. So hope you guys have a